get started with our workshop and introducing Laura to you, who is the co-founder and COO of Ecologica and the founder of What in the Tech. She has a tech consulting business and sits on a number of advisory boards. She has a great passion for community building and philanthropy, has been an active mentor in a number of women-focused organizations, and is a member of the Tech Plus Biz for Sick Kids Council. She's an angel investor in 4 women-founded businesses and was named one of the peak's emerging leaders in 2024 Tech and Canada's top operators, Tech Toronto. So as you can tell, we're really lucky to have her. And thank you so much, Laura, for joining us.
So this is the Founder Fundamentals workshop for business operations. And I'm going to try and demystify it as much as possible because I know it's a black hole. So a little bit about me. Thank you so much for the introduction. And, Ecologica, we're an early stage startup. We're at the intersection of health and climate. And we're IoT. So we have both hardware and software. So if just kind of going forward, if you have any questions or you're trying to build a hardware company, especially, very happy to chat, very different from a software company, and done a lot of like fundraising, pitching, you name it. What in the Tech, I'll talk about a little bit further on in the presentation under the resources section, but it's a community resource trying to bring together folks in the community and make tech more inclusive and accessible, because I find that it tends to be a bit of a gate-kept community. If you're not in tech or you don't know the lingo, it can be hard to get in. As I mentioned, I'm an angel investor. So I have been doing operations for closer to a decade and a half now, across multiple industries. So whether it's wealth management and finance, which I was in for almost 7 years, I shifted over to media. I've been in tech since. And so I've been in government. So lots of different industries. But the fun thing about operations is it's quite industry agnostic. So no matter what company you might be thinking of building or maybe have started to build, whether that's, a brick and mortar cafe around the corner or a B2B SaaS company, which is business to business software as a service, in case you don't know the acronyms, it's something that, it will be relevant to you. You'll definitely find some nuggets in here. I've actually mentored with the Ella program through Y-Space. Highly, highly recommend it. One of the mentees I had, I'm still doing coaching with. So it's a really great program. Y-Space does an really, truly extraordinary job with supporting their entrepreneurs. So if you're interested in building a company, you've started to build a company, you can definitely check out their programs. They did not ask me to say this, by the way. This is truly just something that I've seen and experienced. Not all accelerator programs are created equal. All right, so what can you expect today? I'm going to do a bit of an overview of operations because, like I mentioned initially, I recognize that it's a bit of a black hole and people really struggle to define it. And my definition and what I say to you today may differ a little bit from somebody else, but I'm going to try and keep it as broad as possible and just within reason for you to not to be too overwhelmed by all the information. I'm going to do a bit of like business unit outlining, so just kind of understanding some of the business units that can fall under operations. At the end of the day, basically everything that happens in a company touches operations in one way or another. So we'll go through some of those nuances. Then I'm going to just like walk you through those actual individual business units, the ones that are kind of bigger or more important, and some of the tasks that you might be associating with them. So whether it's, looking for software, whether it's hiring, all those types of things, we'll walk through some of those things. I will do a little bit about the importance of connection and community just in relationships generally. I could do an entire workshop on that alone, and I have, because it truly is that important. And so now that you're a part of the Y-Space group, I highly, highly recommend trying to keep in touch and trying to take advantage of their programming as much as possible. I will be providing a resources page as well. So there's some people that you can follow, some websites, things like that. I'll walk you through, and then we can do some additional Q&A. What I'll ask is, as I go through kind of the business units, so it'll be, like finance and legal and things like that, they will be very separated. if you have any questions that are very specific to that business unit, so it's very specifically a finance question or a legal question or a marketing question, please go ahead and just ask once I'm kind of done through the slide. They'll be monitoring the chat and stuff. So I'll answer questions as we go. It'll make it a bit more interactive as well. So don't be shy. If you have any questions that are more general or vague, or maybe more just specific to you, I'll ask you to just leave those to the end. So let's get in. So what is operations? It seems like an easy question to answer, but I promise you from what I've seen in the startup ecosystem, it's not. The way I like to look at it is from a few different angles. So it's how do we do things, processes, procedures, all that kind of stuff, in order for those things to get done, right? So those are really important. And that's why so many of the business units in a company will touch operations, because every single thing that you do, you need a how for it to get done. One of the tough things with operations, and I would say this is coming from somebody who's been an operator and has worked with folks who maybe don't value operations the way it should be. You know, operations is working really well at your company when you don't know it's working. And by that, I mean, I equate it to plumbing, hence the graphic. You don't think actively about the fact that your shower turned on or that your toilet flushed, right? You're not really thinking about those things. They just happen. And that's kind of how operations acts. However, if your toilet overflows or if your pipe bursts or your shower doesn't turn on, it's going to be chaos. And that's also very, very similar to operations. I know of a founder who raised their seed round, so it's a pretty big, couple $1 million, and all of the co-founders went on vacation. They were like, "Oh, we did this. We finally went on vacation. It was fantastic." And then everything broke while they were away. And it's because they hadn't set up the foundation and the operations for it to work properly without them. So you really want to make sure that you're looking at processes, procedures, efficiencies, softwares that are repeatable. And that's really, really, really important. So you want to be able to like rinse and repeat everything, whether it's, hiring. Okay, great. We have a job just like template so that you have to change the experience and those kinds of things, but it's like a templated thing. Okay, we have templated agreements, we have templated onboarding. Like those are really important because that means it's repeatable, and that's going to mean that you can scale. And then something that's interesting to consider too on the operation side is the generalist versus the specialist. So when you have a large organization, you're going to see a lot more specialists. And when you have a small organization, you're going to see a lot more generalists. So a generalist essentially means that's what I am, where I'm pretty good at a lot of things. I'm pretty good at like figuring out how to, run payrolls and invoice receivables, all that kind of stuff. I'm pretty good at some digital transformation, some marketing, but I'm not a niche like professional in any of those things. I just have a general knowledge of it. I can hire for it, those kinds of things. A specialist is going to be somebody who's like formally trained potentially in HR or things like that. So when you have a huge company, you have those things really, really, just the gears are very specific, versus at a startup or an early stage company, or if you're starting your own thing, you're going to be very much a generalist. So here are some key business operations units. BizOps stands for business operations. I do try and explain any acronyms, things like that. So if anybody has questions, please let me know. But you're looking at, the general things that I'm sure all of you have heard about. You maybe haven't heard them referred to as business units, but that's essentially what they're kind of called. So you're going to have your finance, your legal, just general operations of how the company is operating, HR and people and culture, as it's called now a lot, sales, marketing, and then some other stuff that I'll also go through in less detail. But I'm going to focus on those 5 in more detail. So I'm going to stop for a second there. Does anybody have any questions around any of this so far? Take that as a no.
We're good on the questions, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll start with finance. Money is an important one. And so these bullet points that I'm going to have for all the business units are really just examples. It's not everything that's included under the buckets, but they are some of the things that are bigger or potentially could really impact the business. So, you want to really look at the setups, right? So, when it's referring to budgeting framework, when it's referring to revenue projections, cost estimates, all those types of things, right? You want to make sure on the operation side that you're setting up a process and a procedure that anybody can follow, right? So part of what your job would be operationally for finance would be, okay, let me find my software for accounting, right? Whether that's Xero or QuickBooks or whatever, right? Okay, I'm going to find that. Let me find an expense software, right? Because we know that receipts in a shoebox are not your accountant's favorite thing to deal with. So we want to make sure that we can take photos of receipts, put them in. They automatically get uploaded into your accounting software, right? So all of these automations, efficiencies, processes, those are the things you want to be thinking about. And how are you going to take those foundational pieces in order to execute on these things, right? Forecasting tools, KPIs, key performance indicators, and just for reference to ROI is return on investment. So KPIs are things that you want to plan out. You want to think about like, okay, what are some of the things this quarter, this, year, in the 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, what are some of those key performance indicators that we want to be looking at? And then what your operational structure is going to do is actually see how are those things getting done and are they being done and how are you measuring those things for success, right? So you're going to leave the accounting to the accountants, you're going to leave the bookkeeping to the bookkeepers, and there will be a certain point in your, if you're starting a business, you will be your own bookkeeper, don't get me wrong. But generally speaking, once you've built a bit of a company, those things can all be outsourced, but your bookkeeper needs to know how are you categorizing certain things, right? Depending on the type of business you have, you might be able to write certain things off, certain things you can't write off, right? Your accountant can help you with that. And so you really want to make sure that you have that documentation super clear of like, okay, here are all the categories for all of our receipts. This goes into these, and these, and then your bookkeeper can use that as a frame of reference, right? So you're always creating essentially reference libraries for how to do things, what to do, and all that kind of stuff. Because then if you're sick, if you're on vacation, if something happens or you're not around to answer a question, people can go somewhere and find that resource. So does anybody have any general questions around the finance piece? Happy to dig into more of these specifically if anybody would like me to.
I think we're good on questions so far.
Okay. So legal. Oh, somebody just raised their hand. It actually notified me. Yes, Michelle.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to clarify what R&D meant.
Research and development.
Okay,
So
and
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to understand what their role involved.
Yeah, so R&D, research and development, can be multiple things. So if, for example, you're doing a software company, that's actually like usually building of the software. If you're doing anything in hardware, which is, like I'm looking at a cell phone, so let's call it a cell phone, right? It's like building the actual thing, having a prototype, having a first version. In software, your first version would be called a beta. So you have alpha, and then your first testers would be on a beta model, right? And then they give you feedback. And so it's a lot of like the research that you're doing from customers, from actually prototyping, that kind of thing, and then developing it further. Does that make sense and answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
No problem. Anybody else before I move?
There's also a question in the chat, Laura, asking if you recommend any softwares for receipts keeping and uploading.
So I would say most accounting softwares now have that feature or have that feature as an add-on. I'm generally speaking a believer of trying to minimize the amount of softwares you use unless there's something that's like really hyper specialized that somebody is like just exceptional at. And so I believe like QuickBooks, for example, I'm pretty sure has like a receipt capture function. There's also, funny enough, some CRM, so client relationship management systems. And so those are like Salesforce, Zoho, things like that. A lot of them also now have receipt capture features. So you can generally find them within those platforms that already exist. I have used one that I really liked, and it was called Dext, D-E-X-T. And I'm honestly not, I can't remember now if they rebranded to Dext or they rebranded from Dext, but I'm sure if you Google that, you'll find either way. But they were a really great platform, and I found that it learned really quickly the categorizations for different things, which made my life a lot easier because then I really only had to categorize for 1 or 2 months really diligently, and then it kind of started to automate that process for me. Anything else?
Thank you, Laura. No, that's it.
Perfect. All right. Legal, your next very, very important thing. And so again, lawyer fees are obviously very expensive. There's a lot of software out there that can help you with a lot of things. You do want to be really careful with software depending on, where you're located, what type of business you're doing. All of those things can really be affected in terms of everywhere from your municipal government to your provincial, state government, federal government. It can be really, really tricky. So I do recommend generally going with a lawyer to do any of this stuff. You can do a sole proprietorship or like incorporate really, really easily, and it is a good platform, and it's called Owner, OWNR. There's no E. And so they do a really good job with this, and they do have a lot of those considerations, and they do it quite well priced, much cheaper than a lawyer. So that is an option. But, if you're not really familiar with what a sole proprietorship is, what a corporation is, all that kind of stuff, it can be really overwhelming to do a lot of that research and try and figure out what the right thing is for you. So you kind of have to look at like how much time you might be spending doing all that versus just paying somebody to tell you what the right thing is to do. That's something that you have to really kind of think about yourself. You also want to just think about like, your tax considerations. If you're a corporation, it's going to be different than if you're a sole proprietorship. You're going to have to do an HST number differently, all those types of things. And you really want to also be thinking about just like all the legalities around owning certain names or certain brands. So you want to make sure that you're not infringing on anything yourself, because you don't want to get sued. Now, it doesn't happen that often. You shouldn't be like freaked out or scared of it, but it is something that you need to think about. Best thing you can do essentially is start Googling like whatever name you come up with. If the domain name is available on, GoDaddy, Squarespace, wherever, if the domain name is available, generally a good sign that nobody's really incorporated it. And then you also just kind of want to like look on social media, see if anybody exists. You can also go into I think there's like some people kind of across the globe, but you can go into your government's trademark, like intellectual property arm. And in there too, you can generally search for trademarks, search for patents, search for copyrights, all that type of stuff. So you can search for people's names, see if it's already trademarked, make sure you're not infringing, and then you're like good to go. I do also recommend especially trademarking. Here in Canada, I believe it's like $50. So it's really easy to trademark something if you want to. And it's just something that's like a nice little added protection. You get a cute little certificate, you get it all done. It's great. In terms of intellectual property, for those who may not be familiar with what that might be, it's essentially like you are legally protecting what you're building. It can be a bit tricky when it comes to software. It's definitely much more relevant to hardware. So generally what you'll be recommended to do with a lawyer, with an IP specific lawyer, is file like a trade secret, which essentially you can keep for I think 2 or 3 years, and then that keeps it completely secret. However, once you've filed actual patents, they become public. And so that's where like you do want to be talking to a lawyer around this stuff. There's some really great programs out there as well if you end up going in the route where you need intellectual property protection. In Ontario, there's something called IPON, IP Ontario. They do really great grants. There's also federally Elevate IP Plus, and so they do really great grants as well. And you need to be a part of an accelerator. I believe Y-Space is one of them, but you need to be a part of an organization in order to access some of those. IP Ontario is totally open. And I believe all the provinces do have things like this. The US has a ton of IP protection because they're trying to keep a lot of this in countries. So it's really important though, just to like start thinking about these things. And if you're building something, you want to make sure that you're protecting like whatever you're building. Regulatory compliance, you're looking at, again, if you're building a medical device, that's going to have very different regulation than if you're building, a new water bottle or something like that. So you want to be thinking about like, are there any government like ministries or anything like that regulate what you're building? So we work with air purification, for example. We tried to go to both like Health Canada and the FDA. And like the US health arm, and they don't regulate air purifiers. They just won't do it. We tried getting regulated, but they won't do it. And so it really depends on what you're building, but you're going to be like thinking about that as well. Is there any questions on the legal side of things?
Hello.
Amandeep. Sorry, go ahead, Mohammed.
Good evening, everyone. So I just go quickly with regards to my questions. First off, I did some research and I took some appointments with some people in charge of consultation with regards to opening the business. And I asked this question. I wanted to protect the name of my company within the whole Canada. And the person in charge told me that I need to sign my business as a corporation, and it should be federal corporation. And he also added that I need to pay a lot of money in order to protect that name. So he basically suggested me that don't look for protecting the name of your company, just focus on creating your product and finding the customers. So my question is that this trademark privilege that you mentioned, does it protect, for example, the name of the company, the logo, which is really important to me? And the next question is that I really appreciate it if you can come up with some examples with regards to, for example, you would be like saying for fashion, for these kind of businesses, I suggest these type of corporation or these type of business entities. For these type of sectors, what do you suggest?
So I'll start with the second question first because to be honest, I can't do that. If you're building a fashion company or you're building a food company or you're building a, computer company, they all have such different requirements, even if you're looking at two different fashion companies or like they're just so different and the person building it is going to be looking for different things. So it would be a disservice for me to recommend anything to anyone without sitting down and understanding their specific needs. So generally speaking, if you're starting a company, you do want to incorporate, but again, maybe it makes sense for you to incorporate overseas in the US. Maybe it makes sense to incorporate in Europe. Maybe it doesn't. And so it's just so individual to the person and what they're building. And like the grant landscape and all that kind of stuff that it would just be not fair of me or like not appropriate, frankly, of me to recommend anything specifically to anybody. I highly recommend I'm not a lawyer also so there's also that. So I'm not familiar with a lot of the like background legal stuff because again, from the operations perspective, what you want to be thinking about is like, what types of questions am I asking my lawyer? Are they documenting things in a way I can understand? Are they documenting things in a way that like whoever I hire maybe in the C-suite or the executive team, I can like relay that information to them very clearly. They know where to find that information. Like for example, when you're applying to a lot of grants or you have applications for stuff, especially in the US, what's your like corporate name? Because your incorporated name or your LLC or whatever it is may have a different name. There's something called a DBA, which is doing business as. So you could do, there's a lot of numbered companies. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Canada Inc. That's the incorporation, but they're doing business as Ecologica, right? So you don't have to do business as the same name that you incorporate as. You can have that like informal name. And so again, like for some people, it makes sense to incorporate federally. For some people, it makes sense to incorporate provincially. So it's just a but that I would recommend just using an actual lawyer for, because they're the ones that are going to know your specific needs in relation to what all the regulations are. But you just really want to be thinking about like the communication aspect and making sure you understand all these things that are important so that you know to ask the right questions. In terms of a trademark, like I would say, when you say you worked with a consultant, I'm not sure if you're talking about a lawyer or a business consultant, because those obviously are very different. Trademarks, again, it's tough to say without knowing your very specific scenario. Trademarks tend to be around kind of like names and logos. Patents tend to be around actually like your product or like how to build the product, and how it's, and it has to be unique, right? You can't get a patent on something that somebody's already done. So it does have to be unique. Copyrights tend to be on like bodies of work, like, you can copyright a book, you can copyright music, things like that. So those are kind of the differences. You should be able to trademark your logo. And depending on the name, you may or may not be able to trademark it, right? So if somebody else has already trademarked that word, even if it's a weird, like BizOps, if somebody has decided to trademark BizOps, then I won't be able to trademark it, right? But I could still technically do business as BizOps. You have to think about the fact that that person already owns the trademark. So it's a very kind of specific scenario. And I would say if you worked with a business consultant, you should probably work with a lawyer in this specific area, because you want to make sure you're protected. And most consultants won't know the law as well as a firm that specializes in IP.
So I'm sorry for cutting you to wrap this up. To make everything short, regardless of the type of the entity, I can easily trademark my logo and my business name. Is that correct?
Well, again, depending on what's already trademarked, like it's
In case it's not been trademarked before.
has it, but the name might have been trademarked by somebody else.
No, it's a unique name because it's a combination of Persian and English names. So I'm pretty sure it
Right,
hasn't
but
been
you'd have to go into the trademarks website, search it, make sure it's not there. And then there are ways to apply for trademarks online. So you can, if you follow the instructions, you should be able to do that. Like
Thank you.
I think it's the CIPO, CIP. I think it's the Canadian Intellectual Property Office or something like that. You can go into their trademark section, and then from there, you just kind of have to follow their prompts. But again, it may not be worth it for you to trademark it. Maybe it is. Only a lawyer can tell you that.
And you said the owner is your suggestion with regards to getting a lawyer with regards to our legal matters.
Owner is a platform where it's a software. So they're not lawyers, but it's a software where you can incorporate or create a sole proprietorship pretty cheap, and pretty easily. But I don't believe they have full legal services. So if you've already kind of decided on what you like, if you know, okay, I want to be a sole proprietor, I want to do this, this and this and this, then Owner's a good platform because it makes it easy and cheap. But if you have no idea whether you should incorporate or not, all those kinds of things, then the legal, like with a lawyer, is the route to go.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump on here. Mohammed, I sent you a message as well. But we do work with a couple of lawyers, and I think all you need right now is some sort of guidance before you make a decision as to what route you want to take, whether you want to just do it yourself and use Owner, or you want to use a lawyer. So if you could just write me an email explaining what your business is and what you what kind of support you want, I can put you in touch with a few people who will be able to help you. Sorry, Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Lena. Any other questions before I move on?
There was just one question about how to apply for trademarking, but I think you've already covered that, and a few people in the chat covered that as well. So I think you can just move on.
Okay, yeah, perfect. I think it's called SIPO in Canada.
Perfect. Thank you.
So the next kind of like larger function, and arguably potentially your most important is your people. So human resources, a lot of tech companies call it people and culture. And so from that, I would say the people side and the culture side of a company is probably the thing that needs process the most and like really, really repeatable process the most. And it's probably something where you're going to have the most struggle with doing it well. And that's because people are so different, right? The law is the law. Money is money. A dollar is a dollar. Whereas with people, one way of onboarding somebody may not work the same way as somebody else. And so some of the things that you want to be considering on the HR side and the people and culture side is just understanding right now, what does that org chart look like? Okay, who's in the company? What are some of their roles? What hats are they wearing? And then you also kind of want to think about, okay, maybe you're doing a fundraising round, maybe you've gotten a big sale or a huge contract or whatever, and you're going to hire some people. Where are they going to fit into that map of kind of work? And that will help you from there kind of shape, okay, this is where I need some support, or this is where I need some support. That will help you shape those like potential job descriptions that you maybe put out, and things like that. So like for recruiting. So one of the things that I always recommend again is templating. So people and culture aspect, I would say the templating side is relatively easy. And hiring is probably the most time consuming and labor intensive things you can do. So the less time you have to spend, writing a job description or an onboarding handbook or we're recording like, okay, yeah, vacation days and blah, 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 all those kinds of things. The easier it gets to hire and the faster you can do it. And so if you do have turnover or if somebody leaves or all of a sudden you're like, oh, and I need 3 more people, it becomes a significantly less stressful thing to do. And so you really just want to make it super, super easy from the very, very beginning of, okay, we need to hire for a role, all the way to, okay, we found the person, we've given them an offer, and they're starting tomorrow. How are we onboarding them? That's kind of your whole process for recruiting. You can definitely template out, certain things like the about section of your company in a job role. Even the qualifications and expectations, there's certain things that you may be across the board. Maybe all the jobs are remote or hybrid, or maybe all of them are located in a certain city. So those are the types of things that you can kind of leave in. I believe now in Ontario, pay bands are required to be in job descriptions. So like, you want to consider some of those regulatory things around there too. But even if you just have certain templates of like salary, location, etc., even if it's not filled out, like it's there for you to remember to fill it out when you are hiring for that role. And then, you have the interview process, all that kind of stuff, and you want to processize all of it. You want to ask the same questions of people. Obviously, you want to have a natural conversation, but just being able to compare, apples to apples versus like if you have a totally different conversation with one person than another, it can be really hard to assess them. And then once you want to have a templated like letter of offer.
You can wait if you want, but there's like.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Anyways, you want to have like a templated offer. You want to have a templated contract agreement. And contract agreements, like the employment agreements, should be going through a lawyer, 100%. Absolutely, because I've seen, honestly, the amount of contracts I have seen where there are absolutely illegal clauses in them is astounding. And so you think you're protecting yourself by typing in some sort of clause, but they are null and void, and sometimes they can void the whole contract. So don't do that. And then you want to have that onboarding process. So Okay, when somebody starts, do they already have all their, make sure they all have their equipment if you're providing laptops or mouses or anything like that, or notebooks, whatever it might be. You want to make sure that they're like set up on the systems, that they have an email, that they, all of those types of things are super, super important. You want to make sure you can walk them through their benefits, their compensation, all that kind of stuff. And again, you want them to be able to find all this information in a really easy place. So you can use what's called an HRIS system, a human resources information system. Humi is a really, really good one. I've used it before, super easy to use. It's Canadian. And I think they just got acquired, which is very exciting for them. But it's a good one because like it just has a lot of the Canadian information in there. But that's a place where you can put an employee contract, you can put their benefits package, you can put their compensation package, everything in there. And then if ever they want to refer to it, they can look instead of coming to you and saying, hey, I was wondering, like, do you have a copy of my contract, blah, blah, blah. And then again, now you have this time wasting, right? So you're always trying to find these processes and like efficiencies. And again, what you really want to be doing is when you maybe are no longer doing the hiring. Maybe you've hired a recruiter. Maybe you've hired an HR person. Congratulations, your company's grown. You're not the only one hiring anymore. Very exciting. Do you want to spend half an hour to an hour in a meeting saying, hey, thanks so much for coming on. Here are the templates. Here's the onboarding. Here's what we use as a software. This, and this. Enjoy. Or do you want to spend days, sometimes weeks, trying to figure out that process with somebody, right? And then you're wasting your time. You're also wasting their time when you've hired them to do a job, right? So everything that we do in all of these business units is that foundational work. It's the foundational work in order to make these business units run without our intervention, right? That's what you're always kind of thinking about is what can I put down on paper? What can I put down in a process? What can I put down in a list? Like whatever, however you decide. I know a lot of companies use Notion for this type of stuff, but it's really whatever you think works best for you. But it's how do you make it so that you are no longer responsible for that entire function and every piece within it? Oh, I should ask. Any questions on the people and culture or HR side?
You're all good. There's nothing yet. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, so sales and marketing, I had kind of bucketed them together in the slide, but I've separated them out for the purposes of business units. So again, you're always thinking from the lens of the foundational piece. So you don't need to necessarily, I mean, unless you're a solo founder, you're doing it for the first time, you'll have to do sales. You'll have to do all of these business units on your own for a little bit, most likely. But what you really want to be defining is like, okay, how is a salesperson going to succeed? What do they need, right? They need targets. They need key performance indicators. They need to understand what the pricing is like. How much flexibility is there, right? Do they have flexibility to offer discounts? Do they have flexibility? Like how much is the autonomy there, right? That should be documented. That should be part of the salesperson's onboarding process. They should understand the structure, their roles, who are they reporting to? Who do they ask the questions from? All those kinds of things. What's like the voice of the customer, right? So what do they want to communicate to the customer? How do they want to communicate these things? Are you looking for like these sales sharks that are just going to go out and sell? Or are you looking for the people that build the long-term relationships, right? Like there's a lot of different sales tactics and different ways to go about sales. So you really want to understand what works for your organization and also just how you want your organization to be, right? Some people are very happy with slower and more kind of consistent growth because that's what their goal is and that's just very important to them. Some people are just like, I don't care what you got to do, go get that $1 million contract and we'll figure it out, right? And there's not really a good or bad or pro and con for either of them. They're just very different approaches and it's really individual for like the type of company you want to build. Most venture-backed companies or like very quickly scaling companies do need to kind of have those sales sharks in them. But if you're building a cafe, for example, or a brick and mortar store, potentially, a drink brand or something like that, you can have a bit more slow and steady growth, especially in the beginning, because you're likely not going to be looking for venture capital. So very, very different approaches. Neither of them are right or wrong, but the big, big, big thing here is making sure it's documented. Everybody understands, everybody's on the same page, and they're operating the same way. So that if somebody gets a cold call from person A or they get a cold call from person B, they're hearing the same messaging. Of course, it'll be delivered slightly differently. They're different people, but they're getting the same gist. And so those things you really want to structure out, because the last thing you want is a customer potentially being or a potential customer being contacted by two different people and them coming away with completely different expectations. Because there's times where multiple salespeople might touch points with the same customer. And if one is like, oh yeah, I'll give you a 50% discount, no problem. And the other one's like, I can only do 50 and that's the best I got. You don't want to risk that type of reputation. So you just really, really want to define that out. It's super, super important. And just like understanding, some people go for certain customers, some people go for others. Like it's just really important to make sure that those foundational bases are there. Any questions on the sales side?
Hey, there weren't any questions for sales, but I think I might have missed a question earlier. Someone was asking for HR if there's any somewhere they can go to find templates.
Templates for what exactly? Just kind of generally speaking?
I think generally for HR planning, I'd assume.
Okay, so for HR, at the end of the session, there is a resource that I think will be helpful. So just hold there for a little bit. I think I've got some stuff at the end, and I think one of them will be helpful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
For sure. Now marketing kind of falls under a similar bucket to sales, kind of the beginning.
Sorry,
Oh.
I think Mohammed unmuted himself, so just want to quickly check if he has a question.
Yep.
I do. I'm sorry that I'm doing everything with a little bit of delay. But so with regards to the sales, I really appreciate it if we can provide a bit brief about methods and the ways that we can find the best ways to initiate our sales. I know it's a broad question, but for example, I have some friends, they have started their own businesses, and each one of them is suggesting something to me. Some people say Instagram, some people say door-to-door sales, some people say I'm confused. I don't know to invest my time and energy into which I would say methodology of sales. It's a vague topic for me, honestly.
So I'm gonna say something that's gonna probably suck a little bit. Nobody knows because everybody builds differently. Everybody has different skills. So what we do, I can tell you what we do at Ecologica. We treat every sprint, what we call them, as a science experiment. So for, if there's a segment of customers that you think might be a fit for you, you know, um, I don't even know, landscapers, right? Let's say you're building something, you're like, I think landscapers would really like what I'm building. I think they would really understand it, right? Spend 2 to 3 weeks doing nothing but channel development on landscapers, right? And I'm talking like, look at the analytics, send a bunch of cold outreach. Like there's, we use Mailshake, there's like Apollo, there's a million different softwares for cold outreach. Do cold outreach, A/B test those emails. You want to be sending 2 or 3 or 4 even different versions depending on how many people you're emailing. Do some social media posting, all of that kind of stuff, but focus less on the what you're doing and focus more on the who you're doing it for. And so if you do that for 2, 3, sometimes 4, depending on how big the customer segment is, and maybe you go visit a couple landscapers, maybe you go DM them on Instagram, maybe you send them a couple emails, all that kind of stuff. If you see that they're like, oh, this is amazing, I need to talk to you more. They've booked meetings. Maybe you've even made a sale or two. Then you know that channel is worth development. And then you want to develop that sales channel holistically. So you do want to do content around that. You do want to do social around that. You do want to do cold outreach around that, or outbound and inbound sales around landscapers. But focus less on like, oh, it's social media or oh, it's, door to door, and focus more on like, whose door you're knocking on. Like that's more important. And if you do have a bunch of conversations and you're like, oh, they didn't care at all. They didn't understand what I'm building. You're like, okay, no problem. Science experiment has failed. So we try a different one, right? What's your hypothesis? Okay, well, I think that, it's actually going to be better for pavers, like or roofers or whatever, right? And then you can go to that segment and test it again, because then you've focused your time and attention on that segment. And if there wasn't a lot of kind of really uptake of any sort, then you're not going to kind of continue down that path. Does that make sense? And I don't know, Alina, you can confirm. I don't know if there's a sales workshop coming, but there very well might be. There probably is.
There is. It's week 11. So Mohammed, make sure you're signed up for that. We've dedicated an entire workshop on sales.
Yeah, so they'll have a lot of really good advice, but for now, I think that's probably something that you can take away. It's more of the who and less of the how. And again, you want to document all of that. As the operations, you want to document all of that. Okay, so marketing, very important as well, obviously really feeds that sales machine. And so with marketing too, I would say a lot of the really important things to get noted down and to have like processized is that voice. What is the company voice? How do we talk as a company? Because you want to make sure that everybody's talking the same, excuse me, talking the same way. So for example, are we the type of company that is like very happy and bubbly and informal, right? Or are we the type of company that's more like scientific, research-based, technical, right? Neither of them are right or wrong answers. It just depends on who do you want to be talking to, who's your customer, and how do you want to be portraying yourself, right? So you want to make sure that that's documented down, that brand identity and positioning. And so that's going to have that brand voice. And just some of the strategies too, maybe you've run a couple of these sales sprints and you've noticed that the blog posts that you're writing get a ton of traction, or certain social media videos do really, really well. You want to document down, okay, what did I write about? Maybe it was something that you wrote about because something was happening in the world. And maybe that's why it did really well. Okay, maybe timely content is better. Maybe technical content is better. Maybe videos on social media where my face is in them do better, or my dogs are in them, they do better. Like whatever it is, right? You want to be documenting all of these things, because that's how you're going to be handing it off eventually, whether it's to an agency, whether it's to a contractor, whether it's to you hire somebody internally. You want to say, okay, here are all the things I've tried. Here are all the things we've tried as a company. These seem to work. These don't seem to work. And then obviously somebody who is a specialist in marketing, right? Referring back to the generalist and versus specialist conversation from the beginning. Somebody who's a specialist in the field, they might be able to look at it with fresh eyes, but at least they're going to have some sort of base level understanding of how you want the company to be portrayed externally, right? So they might end up trying to decide to go into another direction in terms of like, oh, TikTok is going to get banned in the US. We shouldn't continue using that, but I figured out another strategy. That's totally fine, but you want to make sure that that voice that you've determined works, that's continuing to being used, right? So it's really all about like that process, like a marketing funnel and the lead nurturing side, right? Okay, great. So they've come through this funnel. Maybe they've signed up for your newsletter or whatever, right? What's the process? How do they get segmented? Do we segment them? And once they've like, maybe the process is like, okay, if they've clicked 5 times in an email, we actually follow up with them personally saying, hey, like we loved your feedback on our newsletter. How did you like it? Maybe it's if they've clicked 10 times, we give them a call, right? But those all need to be documented, because if somebody comes into work for your marketing team, they have no idea what that's going to be, and you don't want it all living in your own head. And then again, back to the key performance indicators, that measuring, that tracking, what analytics do you care about? What analytics do you not care about, right? You could have 100,000 people coming to your website, but if 2 people are converting, something is wrong, right? So maybe you care more about the conversion number and less about like the total number of visits. If you want eyeballs on your content because you're going to sell advertising space, conversion doesn't really matter. You want eyeballs, right? So you have to kind of figure out for yourself what are those analytics that are important to you? How are you tracking them? Why are you tracking them? Explain all of that in documentation so that you can pass it off really easily. Any questions on the marketing side?
Yes, there's one in the chat. Which is best option, to hire somebody to work on social media or work on it yourself?
So I would say like there's two considerations. Oh, well, I guess three considerations there. Number one, do you hate doing social media? Because if you do, then you're never going to do it, or you're going to do a bad job of it, or you're going to be inconsistent. You should hire somebody. Can you afford to hire somebody? Also a consideration. And is social media something that is like your time is best spent there? If you think you can like, you can if you can say, okay, I'm not really going to work on content. I'm not really going to work on traditional marketing. I'm not going to do a newsletter or anything. I'm only going to focus on social media. You may not need to hire somebody, but do you understand social media? Do you understand how to read the analytics? Do you know how, other than potentially going viral, do you understand, why a post did better than another, right? You may not. And you may have to just kind of figure it out for yourself. And most founders kind of just have to fumble around a little bit and figure it out because they can't afford to hire somebody. But I would say if you can hire somebody, then absolutely hire somebody who specializes in it. Because then you'll have some people who are specialized in, specifically in Instagram or specifically in TikTok. It gets very granular. And so but you want to again be able to provide them with like an understanding of, you look at like Duolingo or Ryanair, their social media presence is unhinged. Like if you've never looked at their social medias, I highly recommend it. It is absolutely just insanity. Are you okay with potentially a marketer going totally, just on like a crazy thing, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, might ruin your reputation, maybe it'll go viral, right? So you want to have those parameters set for your social media contractor, even if you do hire, right? So even if you don't end up doing it, you want to make sure those parameters are set. And I would say too, the key, unfortunately, to social media, like at this point, all versions of social media is consistency. So if you can't commit to, posting 3 reels every week, to posting 2 or 3 static carousels every week, to putting things on your story every day, if you can't commit to that content creation, then you just either shouldn't do it or you should hire somebody. Like it'll take me like 2 hours to edit a reel. So I'm like, I'm not wasting my time there. But somebody else, who's starting a company maybe has had a personal brand and they're like, oh, reels take 2 minutes, right? So it is personal, but I think it's really thinking about that. How much time am I spending on this and what's the return on that investment?
Thank you, Laura. And I think we had someone raise their hand.
Yeah, I think
If you want to, yeah.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry, I just a question came up to my mind, especially after the fact that Elon Musk is changing the whole world with his presence. So, what I'm trying to learn from him, I don't like him necessarily, but the fact that he first off built a personal brand, a personal image of himself, and then gradually pushed in all his other ideas into the work is so amazing and shocking to me. And I'm trying to copy this model into my own life and business. I was about to just ask you what's your opinion on this type of marketing. So I see myself as a headquarter, and I wanted to have this opportunity to branch out if the business doesn't work for any reason. And I just want to accumulate this view, this fame, this customers, and I can just send them towards other branches, other sectors that I'm interested in. And I feel like with the presence of social media as people's main hobby, I feel like making a personal brand is a priority rather than making a business popping up.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I won't get into any of the Elon Musk stuff. I mean, I think But I will say, like, I don't think you should in any way, shape, or form compare your capability or what you could potentially do to the world's richest man who like bought a company and then made it Tesla. So it's just like he acquired Tesla, like he didn't invent it, right? And I would say I don't think he had much of a personal brand when he was at PayPal, for example. Like PayPal made Elon Musk. Elon Musk didn't make PayPal, if that makes sense, right? Now, personal brand also wasn't very important at that time. But I would just like caution you to remember that the man made like an insane amount of money long before he had a personal brand, right? Like just in terms of timeline. So I will say, though, I do agree with you in that personal branding is really important. Um, Building that trust is really important, and people trust people. They don't really trust things anymore. And so, and social media has played a big impact on that, right? And so there are certain people online, and I've put in a few people as well to the end of the presentation, and I'll try and think of a couple more. But there are some people who have become like really good about being the face of their brand. Joanna Griffiths comes to mind from Nix. Like there's a lot of folks who've done a really good job on that personal piece. And I think the important thing about personal branding is to remember that you're never selling. You are simply, you're maybe talking about something that's timely, that's kind of related to what you're doing or your company. You might be highlighting other people, other companies, events you've gone to, things like that. Thought leadership in the space. So, your opinions on certain things that might be happening. If you're an expert in marketing, you can talk about marketing or, the TikTok ban or whatever, things like that, right? But I would say like you're never just trying to explicitly be like, so I'm selling these things for you to like have a better life, right? You don't want to be like a salesperson with your personal brand online. You want to try and foster like community more than anything. But I do think that part of a founder's job, unfortunately now, is being out there, talking to people, telling them what they're doing, giving updates, all that kind of stuff, whether it's online, in person, or both. I think I probably went to an event every single work day in October last year, because it is a very, very important. And I think you have to be vulnerable. You have to be out there. And again, consistency is the name of the game there. Like the more you do it, the more consistent you are, the more you can build a personal brand, the more you can build trust, and the easier it gets like for you to do it. Like all of a sudden your brain kind of starts thinking in that way a little bit more. It's a little bit uncomfortable potentially for some people when they first do it. The first 5, 10 times you might say something or post something or write something. But then it just kind of becomes second nature. But I will say I do completely agree. Even on social media, your face generally, like if you look at kind of the metrics in terms of like what goes viral, things like that, rarely does something go viral where someone's face isn't in it, right? Humanity is connecting with humanity, especially as we become more and more disconnected physically. We tend to want more of that human connection.
Thank you, Laura. And there's some discussion about marketing as well, but I think we've covered that. There's a session coming up. And just before we
Okay.
move on, I think we had one more person who wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So when you were talking about, let's say, testing different platforms in marketing, what I discovered while piloting different marketing plans, I discovered something, but I did not apply it. I figured out that there is one special community which is more interested in my services, but they don't speak English. But I don't know, I didn't create content in that language because once I started, then I'm making a kind of exclusion and then I will lose some other audience. What would you suggest in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the audience segment is, that kind of thing. And I do think like Alina, I think it was Alina, I can't see you guys, but I think you mentioned that there's a marketing actual workshop in there too. So they may be able to give you better suggestions. Because again, I'm operational. I know a lot. I'm not a specialist in any of it. But I would try and figure out the folks that you're saying are interested in the content or your services but don't speak English. Why are they interested in your services? Like, what is something about them? Like, and can it be replicated in the language that you have the services in or that you have the content in, right? Or is it like, is it a cultural thing? Is it like you kind of have to like attack it from a couple different angles to be like, okay, why does this group specifically resonate so hard with what I'm doing? And am I able to replicate that? And I mean, in any company, you kind of have to do that. Like we're going after hotels right now, but it's like, okay, how do we replicate that same process in commercial real estate, right? Very, very, very different groups. We're going to have different comms. We're going to have, but it's like, how do we replicate that same interest, right? And so it's a lot of like, okay, talking to people, why are you interested? And I have a friend who's a fantastic growth marketer, just probably one of the best keynotes I've ever seen. And she said, you have to talk to customers, right? Talk to 100 customers, figure out what they want. And so I think really trying to figure out what those people have in common, find that thread and see if you can find that thread in the communities that you have or can service. I think that would be your probably your best bet if it's
My
possible.
business is a language and culture. So when it comes to English language and culture and communication, so there are different communities in Canada that they're interested in. But I find, let's say, Iranians more interested to go after them. I mean, if I start, let's say, speaking Farsi, there because I'm from Iran too, maybe because they know me. And that's why they're following me pretty much, let's say, on social media. My fear is something, and my question for you here is that if I start creating content in Farsi on the social media, which doesn't belong to only one community, would that, be kind of damaging my business?
That's honestly such a specific scenario to you. And I think, again, like a lot of it is just testing. If you all of a sudden start captioning, maybe you just caption all your videos or you write your caption, like literally the closed captioning, but also your captions, kind of the same word, but two different things. But maybe you speak in English, but you do closed captioning in both English and in Farsi. And then you also put the caption in English and in Farsi, right? Or maybe you only put the static caption in both languages and you run that for a couple of weeks. Does it make a difference? Test it, see, right? Like frankly, a lot of marketing across the board is experimenting and then seeing what works. And so experiment with it for a few weeks or maybe a month, depending on how much content you post. If it didn't change anything, okay, maybe I can just do it in English. If you see a difference, maybe you go one step further and do both of the captioning in both languages, right? You can kind of just play around with that. Like I don't think anybody can look at this and say, oh yeah, if you put Farsi in, it's going to be terrible for your business or it's going to be amazing for your business. They're going to tell you to test it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you much.
Yeah. Anything else?
All good, Laura. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on and we can come back to questions afterwards.
I'm towards the back end now here anyways. So
Okay.
you do have kind of your general and what I call general operations, and these are your you know, just your softwares. So what they call kind of a tech stack. So that can be your expense management systems people need to maintain it. You need to maintain your vendor relationships, all the quote, those kinds of things. All of the tools that everybody uses. How do you use them, right? How do you organize things in Google Drive or in SharePoint? Everybody needs to be on the same page so that everybody can find the right things. Security is a huge concern, right? The executive team maybe should have access to everything, whereas an intern probably shouldn't have access to everything, right? So access is a really important thing to consider with all of these things. In Slack too, some companies say, okay, all internal communications only happen on Slack. We don't send each other emails. Maybe you don't care about that, right? So all of these things are kind of those general day-to-day administrative operational things that they never really go away because, all of these tools, they come out with a new add-on or they come out with an update, something breaks, whatever. So you kind of always have to keep your eyes on the ball a little bit of what's going on with it. Or alternatively, like maybe somebody gets hired and they're like, oh, I feel like if we did it this way, it would make a lot more sense. And then you can kind of think through that and see if it would make a lot more sense. Like I think listening to brand new people who come into your organization and like they have fresh eyes and how you do a lot of these just like streamlining efficiency procedural things. A lot of the times they'll have really good feedback if they feel like there's that like, oh, I'm getting stuck here or this doesn't feel like it makes sense. It's worth listening to. But again, you really just want to document, okay, is everybody using Asana for like to-do lists? Do we have the projects in there? Like you just want to make sure everybody has, like ultimately what you're looking for is everybody has the information that they need to access to understand how to do their jobs in the best, most efficient, most productive way possible, right? Without interrupting other people, right? So they should have that information readily available. And so that's kind of like your general day-to-day stuff. And again, some of these things, CRM, when your customer relationship management, that's going to touch sales. It's probably going to touch marketing. Some of your data management systems are probably going to touch marketing, maybe your software. Your Slack is going to be that big collaboration tool for everybody. So you do have those business units that we just went through touching a lot of these general ops things. And that's why I kind of said, operations does touch every business unit and does in an ongoing fashion. And then so, we talked about a lot of business units and all that kind of stuff. And here's just like a bunch of other things like to consider, if you will. Some companies have sustainability, ESG, environmental, social governance goals, things like that. Depending on, do you have multiple co-founders? Is somebody you're working with maybe getting old? You want to think about that exit planning, your acquisition strategies. Business continuity is something that when I first started my career, I literally thought it was crazy. I was just like, why are we putting in like, oh, we have team A and team B, and if we need to work from home, I was in office, obviously, at the time. This was pre-pandemic. And it was like, oh, if something happens or if the office burns down or we can't come in, this is how we operate. And then the pandemic hit, and I was like, oh, now I understand why business continuity planning is really important because it doesn't interrupt when something does happen. So planning for those things is really important. If you do have investors, that investor relationship, you need to operationalize that too, right? Your check-ins with them, your updates, their expectations, all that kind of stuff. The more you can just make that into a procedure and everybody knows, what portion they might be responsible for, the easier it'll be. Depending on what you're building, you may have a supply chain, you may have to do some procurement, some manufacturing, even things like that. That'll be really important. Your IT, so literally your physical infrastructure, who's like, you got to get computers out to people. You might have your own servers if you're working on something super secure. Cybersecurity is really, really, really important. And like generally the operational team will be responsible for like finding, a cybersecurity firm that might help them do some fake phishing scams, see what the vulnerabilities are, all those kinds of things. Any digital transformation. So for example, at one of my old firms, we were not on the cloud, nothing like that. And I did that whole digital transformation where we moved everything onto, the cloud and remote and all that kind of stuff. So you have some of that innovation. AI is a really good example right now for digital transformation. Like, how are you using that? What's allowed? What's not allowed? The tech stacks, which I referred to kind of in the previous slide of like, okay, for marketing, here are all the like softwares we use. For sales, here are all the softwares we use. And then you just have like, sourcing vendors. So if you have, whoever runs your phones or your FIDO or your internet or whatever, if you're in office, then you're, potentially your real estate agent or your property manager, things like that. So it's just all of these relationships that you have to kind of maintain or know exist. And again, they need to be documented. When do you go to who, all that kind of stuff. And people obviously switch roles all the time. So you want to make sure you're keeping all of those things updated. So this is just like another kind of list of things to kind of consider as you're building your business, in order to kind of make sure you have a fulsome understanding of all of the operational structure. I saw a hand raised, so let me hear it.
Hi, thank you, Laura. So my question is just about supply chain and procurement. Could you please speak a little bit about supply chain and what it's about? Because I've heard it some in select spaces sometimes, and yeah, I still don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, supply chain is essentially like the process your product has to go through to like get to you or the customer, right? And so when there was a lot of like supply chain disruption during the pandemic, which is probably where you heard the term, said 100 million times on the news and on social media. But essentially what was happening was on the manufacturing side, right? So there's a lot of things manufactured overseas, right? They're not manufactured, down the street. They're China, Vietnam, all sorts of places, depending on what you're manufacturing. And so that's kind of the start-ish of the supply chain is like, okay, we need to get the raw materials. So we need, the metal, we need the plastic, we need the whatever. Then we need to get the manufacturing done of each individual pieces. And then you have like the assembly, right? So all of the things need to get put together. And then you need the packaging. And then you need generally shipping to the country on like a container or more in like a bulk aspect. And then from there, you have your distribution to your customer, right? So all of those things put together kind of create the supply chain, right? So there was a lot of disruptions when people were sick or manufacturing plants shut down, things like that, because things couldn't actually like go from one to the next. And depending on how sophisticated it is, sometimes one piece of the puzzle is built in one country, another piece of the puzzle is built in another country, and then it's assembled in a third country. And so all of those things, like your supply chain can end up becoming very, very complicated. Like the one I just kind of ran through would be a relatively simple one, but that's just kind of the idea of what a supply chain is.
Thanks so much. I feel I understand it better. Thank you.
Good, I'm glad. Any other questions on any of these kind of more high level points here?
There is a quick question that just came into the chat. He says he's trying to figure out all of this and it can feel daunting. And I know that BizOps grows with the business, but how does it learn at all and start to train the brain to think of things in an operational sense at the beginning?
Oh, great segue to one of my final slides. I will say if you start to document anything in your brain at the beginning, you are 200% above or over most founders. So if you can even just like it can be really high level. It doesn't need to be super organized. It doesn't need to be perfect. Like, don't focus on perfection here. If you can just have like a couple different folders or a couple different documents, marketing, sales, legal, financial, whatever, anything that pops into your head, you just type it down onto that doc. And then like, you're like, oh, I did this thing. Okay, let me like record it. Let me record the results of this marketing campaign. Like, oh, okay, this sales, we did really well this year and like whatever. The financials you want to kind of be updating on a regular basis or outsourcing, right? And then it sort of like starts to come together, but ultimately like even just brain dumping out onto paper for the different like bigger business units can be really, really helpful because it'll help you recognize the gaps and the priorities. And so yeah, you're not going to have a template and an onboarding document and an employee handbook and an HRIS system set up and everything for your first employee. That's not going to happen, right? But knowing that those are things that you need to set up is important. having it written down that it's like on a to-do list somewhere, and maybe even talking through your first, second, third hire. Maybe you do the process slightly differently each time. Maybe each hire gets a little bit easier and a little bit better, and they can give you some feedback on like, oh yeah, this part was great, or maybe this part was not so easy, or I didn't really understand it, right? And then that's just kind of how you build it into a very fulsome package, if you will, or like a full onboarding thing. And then, you can hire some professionals like once you're at that point where maybe now you're hiring 5 people and maybe you have a marketing team, whatever. That's when when this documentation is going to really matter, but it's also when it's going to become more complete. And so a lot of this, it's kind of like this slide for me is like most of it won't be useful today, right? It's important to start doing though, because I'm telling you right now, it is 100 times easier to write down some of your goals, and like for each of the business units, like 2 or 3 things that maybe you can get done once a quarter or once a month. Like maybe for each business unit, you do one major thing once a quarter, right? You can set those types of goals. Then like let's say you raise $1 million pre-seed. Now you have to hire 4 people. Now you have to get customers because you have to 10x that $1 million in a year. The last thing you want to do is write down processes and procedures, right? And so getting those things in order before there's a major change to the business, whether that be funding, whether that be growth in terms of like employee headcount, any of those things, maybe a pivot in your business or, an acquisition, you just want to make sure that those like foundational level set pieces are there, because doing it after the fact becomes significantly harder, more time consuming, and just wasteful of your own resource, like for yourself. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, just try not to take it like too over the top. Like you don't have to worry about every single thing. It's really important that you get your legal like whether you're incorporating or whatever, like get that done properly. Make sure you have it. Make sure you have a bank account. Make sure you have somewhere to like do your accounting, right? You might switch softwares. That's okay. Maybe you don't have an accountant right away and you do it on Simple. That's okay, right? So you can kind of just like it's building blocks. So build as you go. I will touch really, really quickly on relationships as I promised. Like I mentioned, I could for sure do an entire probably hour and a half just on relationship building and networking. Every single opportunity that I've ever gotten in my life, in terms of work, panels, advisory boards, you name it, has come from my network. And so I want to really reiterate how key relationships are to your success. And by this, I also mean of all of the things I talked about. It is so much easier for me to find the right accountant, the right employee, connections to customers, when I can ask people for those things, right? Oh, hey, person who, runs a great company, are you happy with your accountant? We're looking for a new one that's cross-border and does the US stuff. Can you recommend someone? Yeah, here, his name's John Smith, right? That is significantly less time consuming and way easier for me than starting to Google, going down the rabbit hole, hoping a review is, accurate and real, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So relationships are really important for the success piece of your business. They're also just really important to like actually save you a lot of time and frankly headaches. If you talk to 3 or 4 people and they're all working with the same person and they're really, really happy, chances are they're probably a good person to work with, right? And so leveraging and like building the network and doing that personal branding piece that we kind of talked about earlier, that can be really, really helpful for you to actually build your business in a more effective and like easier way, significantly less stressful way. So I just really wanted to reiterate that fact. And Alina, if you ever want me to do a relationship building session, I can do that too. So I believe you'll all get this deck. Oh, sorry, I got a hand raised. I'll listen to the hand first before I get into this.
Thank you so much. I have a question about the making a relationship. as an entrepreneur or the person has a new startup company, if I want to collaborate with the university or the other a small startup company, I want to know how to make sure they are happy with the collaboration while as an entrepreneur, I have to be careful about my business and how to move forward my business while um, make happy the other stakeholders as a, for example, professor of the university that I'm collaborating with, and a startup company. I'm not sure what is how I figure out my relationship is in the good path.
So, okay, I may answer some of your question in a way that's not doesn't really potentially answer the question, but I promise it'll get there. Um, so when it comes to the relationship side, like a big thing for me is like building that genuine connection. So I'm not going out and meeting people and like asking to collaborate right away. You really want to build up, similar like with a customer potentially on social media, like you want to build up that trust. You want to like genuinely build up that authentic connection with somebody. Because it'll make it also, more to answer your question, easier to work with them or collaborate with them, right? So I tend to approach every networking opportunity or relationship building aspect with like not a like what can you do for me or what can I do for you, but like who are you? I'd like to get to know you, right? And then the next thing I usually do is like how can I help? And maybe that is like potentially collaboration, but maybe they just need an introduction to somebody. Or maybe they need a ticket to an event that I happen to have an extra to, right? And it can be as simple as that. It can be like they're like, oh, they've made a really good post and they want me to share it, right? Like it can be really, really simple things to just build up some of that trust. And then kind of understanding like, oh, hey, there might be an opportunity for us to collaborate. Like we should talk about it. And then from there, I think it's really important that like if you end up going down that route where you do, agree to a collaboration, whether they're a new customer, whatever it is, outlining your success criteria is really, really important, right? So asking that other person like what is success to you in this collaboration, like what would you be happy with, what would you be unhappy, like what are the timelines, what are your expectations, like all those kinds of things. The more you can manage upfront, like if they're like I want this to be amazing in 2 days and you're like well it's not going to happen for 2 weeks, how do we figure that out, right? And I think having anything milestone based can be really helpful too. So if you're collaborating with somebody, having those regular check-ins at like any major milestones can be really, really helpful just to make sure that things are on track, that both parties are happy, and that everything is kind of going according to plan. But I really do think that the most important thing you can do to both like protect your business and maintain a good relationship like going forward is like understanding what are the expectations of that other person, making sure that you can actually deliver on those expectations, how they want them to be, and then checking in consistently throughout the process.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure. So then I did put together some resources. If I think of more, I will send them through. So what in the tech, I didn't link it, silly me. The rest are all linked. So what in the tech is the community resource I was referring to at the beginning of the session. It is my community. I launched it about a year ago. It's focused on making tech more inclusive and accessible. We do have a page that's called Trusted Allies. So you'll see a bunch of different service providers, some folks who are more just general that you can talk to. They are all people either I have worked with or I know a number of founders who've worked with them. Everybody's been really happy. So if you're looking for a place to find some people to work with, and it's everything from like PR to legal to software development, like there's a bunch of different stuff. Highly recommend you check it out. There's an events page. It's very tech focused. So this is, take that with a grain of salt. It's very tech focused. But there's an events page. So you will have all of the major events across Canada that are happening in 2025 that have already picked dates. They're up there. There's an accelerator list on there as well. There's like 75 different accelerators across Canada that have been recorded, and that's being updated. It's a bit of a dictionary, a blog, all that kind of stuff. So it can be a really good like general resource. There's a Slack group, all that sort of stuff. Happy to share more information. Just reach out. Early Magazine is a fantastic, it's one of my favorite resources, and I use it very often. It is run by an HR consultancy called Bright and Early. And for anybody looking for some of the templates that somebody was referring to, they have really, really good like guidebooks on different things, like how to build an employee handbook, how to do this, how to do that, the things you should put in there. So like they're almost like blog posty templates, but they do a fantastic job. They are Canadian, so they are focused on Canadian regulation in terms of HR practices, but absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend checking them out. Then there's a few people here. Adam Gellert, he owns a recruitment agency and is a founder as well. He does a lot on LinkedIn. Highly recommend following him if you're looking for, how hiring practices are changing, the trends in hiring, what can make you stand out as an employer, those types of things, really useful. Millie Barker, she's a fractional COO. So that if you're not familiar with the term fractional, it basically means that she's a chief operating officer kind of part-time for multiple different companies. It's generally used when somebody can't bring somebody on full-time. She does have a newsletter, The Operating Table, also really good, very, very operations focused. Daniel Francavilla, a fantastic branding and marketing strategist. So he is somebody I would say that's very generous with his time. If you have some branding questions, marketing questions, things like that, there is a chance that he'll respond to you if you just reach out on LinkedIn. You can let him know you got his name from me. And he's generally just a very helpful guy, but also does a lot of very good content around this. So these are all people that you can follow because they write really good content. Pocketed is a grant matching platform, so you can sign up. They do grants of all sorts, so they're not tech focused or anything like that. It's all sorts of different grants. And while we were talking, the founder did send me a code that you can use. So what I will do is I will update this deck, send it over to the WisePace team. So before they send it out to you, it will have the code in there, but I can also drop it into the chat afterwards. But they essentially, you can kind of put in what your company does, how big it is, what the revenue is, all that kind of stuff. And then they'll match you to certain grants that are available across Canada that you can apply for. If you want to pay for them to write the grants, all that kind of stuff, you can do any of that. Very good non-dilutive resource. Grow Class, it's a fantastic growth marketing and communications course. They also have an incredibly wonderful supportive community. They do have scholarships available for underrepresented and marginalized folks. I think the applications closed for their February cohort kind of at the end of next month or whatever. But so all of these are linked, but highly recommend, especially if you're just about to maybe you're pivoting, maybe you're in between jobs, maybe you're kind of figuring out what you might do, or maybe you're going to be a founder and understanding kind of those basics of communications and marketing, really good. Founder of Grow Class, Sarah, is who I was referring to earlier when I said I know this great growth marketer who has a fantastic presentation. So she is really, really lovely and legit. A founder's diary. It's run by a founder of a femtech company. They do lubricated tampons called Marlowe. Her name's Nadia. She has a really good weekly newsletter called A Founder's Diary. And it's kind of a good recap of all things like being a founder. Even if you're kind of curious about understanding what it might entail or what the life of a founder looks like, very, very well done. Lots of guest appearances. So she does do it every week, but I would say probably every third, issue or so is a guest. I've written it. I wrote it back in June. So kind of a day in the life. It's really well done. David Premier, he's a salesperson here in Toronto. He does a lot of workshops. I think he's got 2 books. And I would say I've seen him speak now a handful of times. By far, the person I've been most impressed with when it comes to sales tactics, also does really, really fantastic content. So just a bit of like a list and overview of resources that you can use and take advantage of. And if I think of additional things, I'll make sure to send it through to the team. But I think it's a really good starting point that kind of hits as many of the business units as I could think of. Here's my contact information. You're more than welcome to add me on LinkedIn. Feel free if you can, or if you have like additional credits and stuff. I know it's like limited. If you can just let me know that you know me through this, that would be fantastic, just because I do get a lot of requests and I don't generally know where they're from. You're also welcome to reach out to me via email. And if there's any other questions, I'm very happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Laura. This was such an amazing session. I know you've been bombarded with questions in between. This was
Been
so
great.
engaging as well, which is amazing. It's really nice to see. We do have a few questions in the chat. I'm going to start from the top from the questions that we had from earlier. Um, so we had, when we were talking about marketing,
Yep.
and you were talking about how you end up becoming the face of a company, we had someone ask, how long is our identity important? And is there a way to separate from our face and personality from our companies? And in another way, can the company stand outside of its founders or human identity?
I mean, I think it's possible. But it is hard, especially early on. So I would say there's I kind of talked about Ryanair and Duolingo's marketing because they really are just absolutely unhinged. And I'll tell you right now, I have no idea who runs those companies. Zero clue who founded them, zero clue who this, actually, I think I've seen the CEO in a few articles, but like, I don't know anything about their structure, right? So they're a really good example of like they are crushing marketing and social media and all of that. But there's very little face of their founders, right? I think early on when you're trying to build that trust, and especially again, depending on what industry you're kind of doing it in, if you need to build trust, like if I'm building something that may affect your health, if I'm building something that like could negatively affect you potentially, or that there's like weird science behind it that people don't understand, that's when that human friendly face can be really helpful. In our case, I'm not the technical co-founder. My co-founder, Janessa, she's the one that is like kind of the brains on the science side. And before I joined Ecologica, she didn't do a lot of like promo. She wasn't out there a ton. I mean, she was also just heads down in her lab building the product. So I always joke that I'm a bit of a personality hire and I've like kind of pseudo become the face of the company. But that's only just because I've been out and about and all that kind of stuff. Now, can you separate it? I think yes. But I do think in the earliest stages, it can be hard. So if you're comfortable putting yourself out there, or alternatively having a mascot, right? Like I think the big thing for Duolingo is like they don't speak through the founder, but they speak through the bird, right? And so I don't know if the bird has a name or anything, but I think if you're able to speak through something that can be humanized in a way. So whether that's a mascot, whether that's an item, whether that's like maybe your product or something like that, if you can make it silly and unique, I think you can totally make it work. But I think you do have to get a bit more creative.
Thank you so much. And I agree. I think the Duolingo and Ryanair marketing strategies are insane. Like that, for the longest time, that was all that I would see. And it is actually mind-blowing how they're able to do that. How they've like actually captivated everyone in such a diverse spectrum of customers as well. That is very cool. Cynthia asked, can you speak to when you're trying to market and sell to big companies like Shell or GE? Any advice on that?
Ooh, honestly, the best thing you can do is find a champion in the company. And so if you can find somebody in the company that really believes in your product, thinks what you're doing is really, really good and useful, all the positive things, and they can help you position your sales deck, your language, your comms, your outreach, etc., in a way that it'll be received kind of more effectively, that is going to be your absolute best bet. So finding that champion within the company, or even multiple champions if you can, that'll be really, really important. And I think focusing on like something that you're doing is really helpful. Like, for example, if you're doing something on the sustainability side, you might be able to find like a sustainability manager or something that's like, oh, I obviously really care about this. But the end customer may not be the sustainability side. It might be like procurement, or it might be whatever, right? Or alternatively, like finding somebody whose your story resonates with, right? Like if you're like, oh, I have this like new cure for arthritis, and you start scouring online, like, okay, let me see the executive team. What boards are they on? And one of them's on the board of the American Arthritis Association. I don't know if that's a real thing. I'm making up a scenario, but like look at like the managers, the directors, the executive team, like what types of boards are they on? What causes do they care about? Who are they connected in with? Where do they maybe spend their time or money? Like sometimes they talk about it online. And then you can kind of go in with a really strong positioning when you go into them, be like, hey, I've seen that this is really important to you, and we're actually trying to solve a problem in this space. Like, could we talk? Now you have created that really personal connection. A, you're telling them, I've done my research. B, I'm asking you for time on something that I know that you're interested in. And that's going to be met with a lot more willingness and like openness to have a conversation. So if you can't find a champion, that may be an alternate way to go, or it may be a very good way to find a champion in the company. But ultimately, if you can get any insider info on how to position yourself, or any internal programs they might have, right? A lot of these huge companies have like innovation arms where they can potentially bring you in as like a bit of a partner, or they have a certain location that does all the pilots, like things like that. A lot of them do have a lot of those programs, so it's worth looking into. The one thing I will caution you when you're working with any huge corporations, is that you really, really want to be careful with your intellectual property. Anything that is created potentially in one of their innovation centers or things like that, the IP could potentially belong to them, or might be shared. You want to be signing NDAs with anybody that you're giving any proprietary information to, especially at companies that could probably, replicate what you're doing because they have $1 bajillion. So just be a bit cautious on that front. But otherwise, I think landing a contract like that's the dream.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laura. And are there any general financial principles or rule of thumb templates you recommend for operating a business in products and services? Specifically, what percentage allocations would you suggest for starting out and for scaling up effectively?
Ooh, again, this is very, very dependent on the business.
Yeah.
Especially with percentages, right? Because like, you don't necessarily need to have an office, but if you're brick and mortar, you definitely are going to have rent, right? So there's just like a lot of considerations around that. I do think if you kind of start Googling a little bit about the type of business that you're going to run, there will be information out there. I mean, most venture-backed companies don't actually, go into the black for quite some time. Like most of them are operating in the red. Bench accounting, I think, is the big story that came out recently where like they just it was really bad. So if you want a cautionary tale, highly recommend taking a look there. Molecule air purifiers, they were losing like $13 million, like I think a quarter or a month at one point because they raised like 100 and some million. So I think it's really important, I think, to operate in a lean manner that doesn't like burn people out. So like there's a fine line between where a lean operating machine and people are like miserable, right? And so I think there's the doing things when you need them and test. It's like, again, testing it out. So like we're raising a seed round right now. We've talked about like who we might want to hire, where we might want to hire them for. We've identified a few very key people, but the rest of the support, we think we're going to need this, this, and this, and this, but we're going to hire on contract, or we're going to hire part-time because we want to see if those roles are actually necessary. Is a full-time person necessary? So again, running that bit of a test of like, okay, let's do a 3-month contract or a 6-month contract. Maybe they can get everything up to speed and then we can hire somebody part-time or a consultant, or so you can kind of like you have to kind of just go through those things. And there's going to be a lot of costs that are maybe potentially upfront, or once you've kind of built the prototype, right? So legal costs tend to be more upfront. Accounting costs you can kind of account for every single year. You can look at like grants, non-dilutive, that kind of stuff too. A lot of it is matching though. So just FYI, you have to have 20,000 in the bank and we'll give you 40, that kind of stuff. But I think it's really important just to like take all those things into consideration and like work it backwards, right? Like, okay, we need to, if we need, here's like our operating budget in terms of like, this is what we need for rent, this is what we need for employees, this is what we need for our software, whatever, all of the things. It's $15,000 a month. Okay, great. What do we do to get $15,000 a month in the door at a minimum, right? And then you can kind of work your sales strategy from there backwards too. Does that mean you need to sign one contract a month, or does that mean you need to sign 3 contracts a month, right? So it'll really depend. Like, do you need 100 customers to sign up for something? Maybe it's just one, right? So kind of working it backwards and then like bringing your sales strategy and those financials together, I think are really, really important. One should inform the other, basically.
Thank you so much, Laura. And our last question, what is the best way for someone to structure and register their first business if they plan to create multiple businesses in the future? Should they set up a holding company or register the businesses as separate entities? And what factors should they consider in choosing the right structure?
I definitely would go for a lawyer with that one. Because I think it really, like, when you say you're going to start multiple companies, is one like a consultancy and the other one is like maybe a software company, or, are you just like set like an e-commerce company or whatever, right? So like different things would require different structures. And again, you can do like a holding company and then you do like the doing business as XYZ, or you do business as 1, 2, 3. And then they pay the holding company. But tax structures can get complicated. It might be if your business for one of the companies is primarily in another country or things like that, that can get a bit dicey if there's grants available, if you're incorporated in certain places, like all of those things, like just depending on the type of company or companies that you want to open, all need to be taken into consideration. And so that's definitely something you would want to run by a lawyer for sure. And like kind of think about the types of companies that you want to be opening.
Thank you so much. Perfect. And there was just a quick clarification about the 2 company examples you mentioned as cautionary tales. If you can just confirm those.
Oh, I think I just mentioned the one. I think it was bench accounting, relatively
Bench
recent,
accounting, perfect.
that went under. I'll double check. Oh, and Molecule, I think, was the other one.
That's an air purifier, right?
They're an air purifier that, yes, it is bench. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.